How did films once locked behind an adults-only label become some of the boldest cult classics of the 70s? Tonight, we're not chasing cheap shock or dusty scandal. We're opening the vault on movies that pushed censorship, taste, politics, animation, horror, and art house drama into dangerous new territory. Some were banned, some were mocked, and some changed cinema forever. These are 15 X-rated 70s films that proved controversy can sometimes hide real genius in plain sight. 15. Inserts, 1975. Hollywood does not bury its failures quietly. It locks them in rooms and lets them rot. That is the sickly power of Inserts, a film that feels less like a movie about old Hollywood glamour and more like a trapped scream from inside its ruins. Richard Dreyfuss plays a former silent film matinee idol known as Boy Wonder, now washed up, isolated, and reduced to performing in and directing amateur adult loops inside a decaying mansion, while the world outside has moved on to sound, glamour, and money. The genius of the film is how small it feels. There are no glittering premieres, no studio mythology. Its uncensored reputation made it sound like scandal, but the real shock is emotional. This is a film about creative collapse, about what happens when fame expires, but ego refuses to die. Strange, bitter, theatrical, and claustrophobic, Inserts turns forgotten stardom into something almost gothic. 14. Score, 1974. Some films whisper their rebellion instead of shouting it, and Score is dangerous because it smiles while breaking the rules. Directed by Radley Metzger, this is not the grimy shock piece many people expect from the adult-only label. It is polished, theatrical, playful, and surprisingly clever, built like a sophisticated chamber comedy where desire, performance, and social games keep shifting beneath the surface. The story follows two free-spirited couples whose evening together becomes less about scandal and more about masks slipping, boundaries changing, and people discovering how much of their identity is simply a role they learn to perform. Metzger gives the film a glossy European elegance, using carefully composed interiors, sly humor, and a strangely relaxed rhythm that makes everything feel more like a stage play than exploitation. What keeps Score interesting is not its adult reputation, but its attitude. It treats pleasure, curiosity, and personal freedom as part of the cultural experiment of the decade. Beneath the provocative surface, it captures the 70s obsession with liberation and the awkward, funny, revealing chaos that came with it. 13. Flesh Gordon, 1974. This is what happens when a Saturday morning space serial gets dragged into a midnight theater and comes back wearing a wicked grin. Flesh Gordon is ridiculous by design, but that is exactly why it survives. At first glance, it looks like a cheap parody of the old Flash Gordon adventures, complete with rocket ships, mad rulers, bizarre planets, and heroic nonsense. But underneath the silliness is a surprisingly inventive cult object, packed with handmade effects, miniature work, stop-motion monsters, and the kind of cheerful absurdity that only the 70s could get away with. What makes it awesome is not sophistication, it is commitment. Everyone involved seems to understand that the movie works best when it treats foolishness like spectacle. The jokes are broad, the costumes are outrageous, and the story moves with the confidence of a film that knows exactly what kind of audience is sneaking in after midnight. Its X-rated reputation may be the bait, but the real fun is its strange love for old adventure cinema. It mocks the genre, but it also worships it. That is why Flesh Gordon feels less like a throwaway parody and more like a warped time capsule from cult cinema's wildest corner. 12. Thundercrack, 1975. Some movies feel haunted before anything supernatural even happens, and Thundercrack opens like a dare whispered during a storm. This underground oddity is part old dark house mystery, part gothic comedy, part fever dream, and part theatrical prank that seems determined to make the audience wonder whether the filmmakers are geniuses, lunatics, or both. Shot in stark black and white, the film traps its characters inside a creepy mansion during violent weather, then slowly turns that familiar horror setup into something far stranger, funnier, and more unsettling. Its adults-only reputation often overshadows the craft, but the atmosphere is the real hook. The creaking house, the strange host, the trapped guests, the melodramatic performances, and the deliberately excessive tone all create a world that feels like classic horror after a nervous breakdown. What makes Thundercrack stand out is its refusal to behave. It is too bizarre for mainstream horror, too funny to be purely frightening, and too visually controlled to dismiss as simple trash. The result is a genuine cult artifact, messy, bold, theatrical, and unforgettable. It feels like a midnight screening that accidentally turned into a seance, with every scene pulling the viewer deeper into its cracked, storm-lit madness. 11. The opening of Misty Beethoven, 1976. Every scandalous era has one film people point to and say, "This one was different." For the so-called porno-chic moment of the 70s, the opening of Misty Beethoven is often treated as the polished exception, smarter, smoother, and more carefully made than most films carrying the same adults-only label. Its basic inspiration comes from Pygmalion, turning a transformation story into a glossy satire of manners, status, image, and performance. What gives the film lasting interest is its sense of control. The photography is cleaner, the pacing more confident, and the humor more deliberate than the reputation might suggest. It is not simply trying to shock, it is trying to entertain with style. Director Radley Metzger, working under the name Henry Paris, brought an unusually elegant visual sense to this world, framing scenes with the eye of someone who understood European art house cinema as much as exploitation marketing. That mix is what makes the film historically fascinating. It shows how close some 70s adults-only cinema came to crossing into mainstream cultural conversation before the door slammed shut. Beneath its provocative surface, the film captures a brief moment when adult cinema thought it might become witty, glamorous, and strangely respectable. 10. Emmanuelle, 1974. Before home video changed everything, one glossy French drama turned adult controversy into international high fashion. Emmanuelle did not become famous because it looked rough or underground. It became famous because it looked expensive, sun-drenched, elegant, and mysterious, selling taboo subject matter through the language of perfume ads, travel fantasies, soft light, and exotic locations. Starring Sylvia Kristel, the film became a global phenomenon, not simply as an adults-only title, but as a cultural object that blurred the line between scandal and sophistication. Its power lies in its atmosphere. The camera drifts through luxurious spaces, the music gives everything a dreamy melancholy, and the story presents liberation as both fantasy and illusion. Today, parts of it feel very much like a product of its era, especially in the way it filters desire through colonial and male gaze fantasies. But that is also what makes it useful to examine. Emmanuelle reveals how the 70s packaged rebellion for the international market, turning private curiosity into a mainstream conversation. It was controversial, glamorous, and impossible to ignore. More than a film, it became a brand, a mood, and a symbol of how adults-only cinema briefly stepped out of the shadows wearing silk and sunlight. 9. Pink Flamingos, 1972. John Waters did not make a movie to please polite society. He made a glitter-covered grenade and rolled it straight into the temple of good taste. Pink Flamingos is not refined, balanced, or conventionally beautiful, and it has no interest in becoming any of those things. Its greatness comes from its total commitment to outsider cinema. Divine leads the film with fearless theatrical force, turning trash aesthetics into performance art, and making every scene feel like a challenge issued directly to the audience. What makes the movie important is not just its shock value but its attitude. Waters created a universe where the rejected, mocked, and unacceptable become the stars, while respectable culture looks cowardly, hypocritical, and dull. The film's roughness is part of its identity. The cheap locations, outrageous costumes, abrasive humor, and confrontational energy all feel handmade by people who knew they would never be invited into Hollywood's front door, so they built their own filthy palace instead. Pink Flamingos remains a cult landmark because it understands something most polished films forget. Cinema can be an act of rebellion, not just entertainment. It is disgusting to some, hilarious to others, but impossible to erase once it enters your head. 8. Heavy Traffic, 1973. This is not animation for children. It is animation with cigarette smoke in its lungs and city dirt under its nails. Ralph Bakshi's Heavy Traffic feels like a feverish sketchbook torn open in the middle of a collapsing neighborhood, where fantasy, frustration, family chaos, and street violence crash together in jagged motion. After Fritz the Cat shocked audiences, Bakshi pushed even deeper into adult animation, but this time, the result feels more personal, more wounded, and more dangerous. The story follows Michael, a young cartoonist, trapped between his imagination and the brutal reality of his home life, where every relationship seems poisoned by anger, disappointment, or survival. What makes the film fascinating is how ugly it allows itself to be. The animation shifts between styles, the humor turns savage without warning, and the city becomes less of a setting than a psychological trap. Beneath the uncensored reputation is a raw portrait of creative escape, a young artist trying to draw his way out of a world that keeps pulling him back into the gutter. It is messy, loud, uncomfortable, and sometimes deliberately cruel. But that is part of its power. Heavy Traffic proves adult animation did not begin with polished streaming satire. It began with films like this, angry, experimental, politically incorrect, and alive with the feeling that the screen itself might explode. 7. In the Realm of the Senses, 1976. Few films have ever looked so calm while walking straight into cinematic danger. Nagisa Oshima's In the Realm of the Senses is not the kind of controversial film that winks at the audience or hides behind cheap provocation. It is cold, hypnotic, and frighteningly serious, built around a relationship that gradually narrows until love, control, obsession, and self-destruction become impossible to separate. Inspired by a real case from Japanese history, the film became one of the decade's most debated art house works, censored in Japan, and treated as a scandal almost everywhere it traveled. But reducing it to notoriety misses the point. Oshima was not simply testing what could be shown on screen. He was asking what happens when desire becomes a private dictatorship. The film's rooms feel sealed off from the outside world, as if society has vanished and only two people remain, trapped inside their own escalating ritual. Its visual style is controlled, almost ceremonial, which makes the emotional descent even more disturbing. This is why the film still matters. It is not awesome in a fun midnight movie way. It is awesome in the older sense of the word, intimidating, severe, and impossible to dismiss. It stands as one of the boldest examples of 70s art cinema pushing censorship, psychology, and human obsession to the edge. 6. Sweet Sweetback's Bodice Song, 1971. This movie did not ask Hollywood for permission. It kicked the door open and dared the industry to follow. Melvin Van Peebles' Sweet Sweetback's Bodice Song is one of the most important independent films of the decade, not because it is smooth or traditionally polished, but because it feels like an act of cinematic rebellion. Made outside the studio system, marketed with defiant energy, and embraced by audiences hungry for a new kind of screen hero, the film helped shift the direction of black cinema and laid groundwork for the blaxploitation wave that followed. Its original restricted rating became part of its legend, but the real force is political. Van Peebles created a film that moves like a chase, a protest, a nightmare, and a street sermon all at once. The editing is aggressive, the music pulses with urgency, and the story turns survival into myth. What makes the film so electrifying is its refusal to explain itself to polite audiences. It is angry, fragmented, stylish, and intentionally confrontational. It captures the feeling of a culture demanding to be seen on its own terms. Some films become classics because they are perfect. This one became a classic because it was necessary. Sweet Sweetback's Bodice Song remains powerful because it does not feel preserved in a museum. It still feels like it is running from sirens, burning with purpose, and moving faster than Hollywood can catch. 5. Fritz the Cat, 1972. A cartoon cat walked into the culture war, lit the fuse, and changed adult animation forever. Fritz the Cat looks playful from a distance, but underneath the crude jokes and counterculture swagger is one of the most important animation landmarks of the 70s. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comic, Ralph Bakshi's film brought adult themes, political satire, racial tension, campus rebellion, police violence, and urban frustration into a form most Americans still associated with children's entertainment. That alone made it feel dangerous. The X rating became a selling point, but the film's real shock was conceptual. Animation did not have to be innocent. It could be cynical, vulgar, angry, and socially observant. Fritz himself is not a noble hero. He is selfish, restless, performative, and often ridiculous. A perfect avatar for a generation intoxicated by rebellion, but unsure what to do with it. The film is chaotic because the culture around it was chaotic. Vietnam, civil unrest, drug culture, political hypocrisy, and generational collapse all bleed into the frame through exaggerated animals and dirty city backdrops. Today, some of its material feels harsh, and very much of its era. But its historical importance is undeniable. Without Fritz the Cat, adult animation might have taken much longer to break out of the nursery. It is messy, offensive, funny, uncomfortable, and revolutionary, a film that turned the cartoon into a loaded weapon. 4. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. 1970 Hollywood has made many satires about fame, but few feel like they were written during a champagne overdose in a burning mansion. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is a film of excess, but its excess is the entire point. Directed by Russ Meyer and written by future critic Roger Ebert, it begins like a show business melodrama and mutates into a delirious attack on celebrity, ambition, pleasure, betrayal, and the rotten machinery behind pop glamour. Everything is heightened: the performances, the editing, the music, the costumes, the dialogue, even the emotional temperature. It does not unfold like normal drama, it lunges. That is why it became such a cult object. The film takes the glossy promise of Hollywood success and reveals it as a carnival mirror, where everyone becomes more exaggerated, more desperate, and more dangerous the closer they get to fame. Its adults-only rating made it notorious, but the real appeal is its wild tonal control. It is camp, satire, melodrama, thriller, and rock and roll fever dream, all stitched together with reckless confidence. What makes it awesome is how impossible it is to tame. You can laugh at it, be shocked by it, admire its craft, or simply surrender to the madness. Few studio films have ever felt this unfiltered. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is not just a cult movie. It is Hollywood eating itself with a smile. 3. Last Tango in Paris, 1972. Some films become famous because people love them. Others become famous because people cannot stop arguing about what they saw. Bernardo Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris belongs firmly in the second category. Starring Marlon Brando in one of his most exposed and wounded performances, the film follows a grieving man who enters an anonymous relationship in Paris, trying to disappear from his own pain while dragging someone else into his emotional wreckage. Its adult rating made it a scandal, but the controversy did not come only from what was on screen. The film's mood was equally disturbing: lonely apartments, gray streets, emotional cruelty, and a sense of private collapse so heavy it seems to stain every frame. Brando brings a raw, broken quality that feels less like acting and more like confession, while Maria Schneider's presence gives the film a complicated, painful legacy that later discussions have rightly re-examined. That is part of why the movie remains difficult to talk about. It is artistically significant, beautifully shot, and historically important. But it is also uncomfortable in ways that extend beyond the story. For a script like this, that tension is exactly the point. Last Tango in Paris shows how 70s cinema pushed past old boundaries, sometimes into greatness, sometimes into moral trouble, and often into both at once. It is not an easy film to admire, but it is impossible to ignore. 2. The Devils, 1971. Ken Russell did not make a historical drama. He built a cathedral of madness and set fire to it. The Devils is one of the most furious, visually unforgettable, and heavily censored films of the 70s. On the surface, it dramatizes a real historical case involving religious hysteria, political manipulation, and public punishment in 17th century France. But Russell turns the material into something far bigger than period drama. The film becomes an attack on institutions. Institutions that weaponize faith, fear, and spectacle to crush anyone standing in their way. Oliver Reed gives one of his most commanding performances as Urbain Grandier, a proud, flawed, charismatic priest caught in a machinery of accusation and power. Vanessa Redgrave is equally unforgettable as Sister Jean, whose obsession becomes part of a larger system of corruption and control. The imagery is stark, theatrical, and terrifying. White walls, black robes, screaming crowds, and ceremonies that feel less like religion than political theater. The uncut reputation came from its intensity, but the film's true danger is intellectual. It does not simply shock the senses, it attacks hypocrisy with operatic force. That is why censorship followed it like a shadow. Even today, The Devils feels dangerous because it understands how power performs morality while committing violence behind the curtain. It is not merely controversial, It is visionary, angry, and alive with the kind of artistic courage that still makes studios nervous. 1. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. The most frightening thing about A Clockwork Orange is not its violence. It is how beautiful Stanley Kubrick makes the nightmare look. At number 1.